The morning sun had barely risen above the jagged outline of Leyte's western shore when the crew of the Japanese auxiliary repair ship Akashi Maru sighted something adrift. It was the 22nd of November, 1944. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of fuel and the ghost of smoke from the naval bombardments that had shaken the islands for weeks. A Filipino fisherman had first spotted the wreck days earlier, a small, splintered craft of unfamiliar design, lying half-submerged near the shallows. Its bow was crushed, its stern torn by explosions. But what survived was enough to make even veteran Japanese engineers fall silent. The officers on deck expected another American landing craft, perhaps one of the hundreds lost in the chaos of the Leyte Gulf battles. Instead, what they found would become one of the most discussed engineering mysteries in the Imperial Navy's remaining months, a machine so fast, so alien in its design philosophy, that it defied everything they had been taught about naval warfare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was a United States Navy motor torpedo boat, an Elco-built 80-footer, its once green hull now bleached grey by salt and sun. Her number had been scorched off, but the brass identification plate still read U.S. Navy PT 323. She had gone missing after a night action off Mindoro, likely ambushed by aircraft or coastal guns. The Japanese believed they had destroyed all evidence of the American Mosquito fleet operating in those waters. Yet here lay one of their wooden ghosts, intact enough to be studied, and in the Japanese engineer's eyes, disturbingly advanced. The first reaction aboard the Akashi Maru was disbelief. To the trained naval architect, the vessel seemed almost absurd. A warship made of layered mahogany planking, reinforced not by steel armour but by the grain of its wood. A hull that could be hoisted by crane with bare hands, powered not by diesel engines like every Japanese torpedo boat, but by 3 enormous gasoline aircraft engines, Packard-built 12-cylinder monsters, the size of small cars. Each one bore a stamped brass plate. Packard Motor Company, Detroit, Michigan, 350 horsepower. When the engineers translated the markings and realized that the Americans had installed 3 of these in one 80-foot hull, their first assumption was propaganda. No small craft, they argued, could sustain 40 knots 45 miles per hour on open water. Yet the surviving logbook, recovered from a watertight locker, confirmed it in the crew's own handwriting. Achieved 41 knots, sea state 4, all engines full. For comparison, the Japanese destroyers that ruled those waters, sleek, steel Fubuki-class ships stretching nearly 400 feet, could barely exceed 36 knots at flank speed. The discovery struck at the heart of the Imperial Navy's technological pride. To understand why this wreck caused such unease, we need to step back into the world of the Japanese Navy in the final year of the Pacific War. By late 1944, Japan's naval doctrine still rested upon the pre-war faith in decisive surface battles, massed destroyers and cruisers maneuvering in coordinated formations. That faith had been born from victories at Tsushima and refined through the 1930s in fleet exercises across the inland sea. The Japanese valued heavy guns, long-range torpedoes, and disciplined formation tactics. Speed mattered, but endurance and striking power mattered more. A warship, in their minds, was a fortress that moved. American PT boats shattered that logic. Where Japanese engineers saw fragility, the Americans saw flexibility. Where Japan prized endurance, the United States prized production speed. An Elco PT boat could be built in 2 months, at a cost that was less than a tenth of a single destroyer, and when one was lost, another replaced it before the enemy even recorded its sinking. The PT's hull, laminated Philippine mahogany over spruce frames, was chosen precisely for its availability and repairability in remote bases like Tulagi or Samar. The Japanese, by contrast, viewed wood as a material of desperation. Their own small boats, subchasers, picket vessels, or the tokusetsu te landing barges were crude in comparison, built hastily as the steel supply dwindled. Yet here was a wooden craft, not of scarcity, but of precision. The interior was neatly wired with labelled conduits. Its navigation equipment, though damaged, still bore the sophisticated fittings of American industrial craftsmanship. Sperry, gyroscopic compass, RCA radio transceiver, even fluorescent lee dials in shock-mounted housings. The Japanese salvage officers could scarcely believe that such sophistication had been mass-produced for what they considered expendable boats. The Imperial Navy's Technical Bureau ordered the wreck to be towed to Cavite, the former American naval base near Manila. There, under the supervision of Naval Engineer Lieutenant Commander Kozo Nishina, the craft was hauled onto dry dock for examination. Nishina was no stranger to foreign designs before the war. He had studied naval architecture in Britain and had seen the power of Western marine engineering firsthand. Yet what unsettled him most was not the American boat's complexity, but its purpose. Every component spoke of a military culture that accepted risk at a scale the Japanese Navy had never dared. The engines ran on aviation gasoline, a volatile fuel that could turn a hull into an inferno with a single tracer round. There was no armor shielding, no watertight compartments to preserve buoyancy, no self-sealing tanks. Everything about the PT seemed suicidal, until one understood how it was meant to fight. The logbooks and diagrams, retrieved from other captured boats, revealed a doctrine of hit-and-run warfare, of daring torpedo strikes executed in darkness at point-blank range. To Japanese strategists, who had trained entire crews to fight in disciplined formations, the notion of such unrestrained individual combat bordered on madness. And yet, the Americans had made it work. The same craft that now lay cracked in the dock had, by conservative estimates, sunk or damaged dozens of Japanese transports across the Philippines, Borneo, and the Solomons. In the Solomons campaign alone, PT boats had been credited with disrupting Tokyo Express runs so thoroughly that Japanese destroyers had to jettison supplies prematurely, reducing the survival rate of ground troops on Guadalcanal to under 20%. Even if few PTs scored direct torpedo hits, their presence forced the Japanese Navy to slow, scatter, and fear the darkness. For the engineers at Cavite, the most shocking revelation came when they inspected the No. 8 Packard engines. Each was pristine in its engineering logic. 12 cylinders, in a V configuration, supercharged, water-cooled, producing 1,350 horsepower at 2,400 revolutions per minute. The Packard 42500 series had been derived from aircraft engines but optimized for maritime endurance. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their own destroyers relied on bulky steam turbines, powerful but slow to respond. Even the fastest Japanese motor torpedo boats, like the Twateuse series, used diesel engines that barely reached 30 knots and suffered from vibration at high speeds. When the Packards were cleaned and refueled for testing, Nishina stood on the dock as the mechanics brought one to life. The roar that followed was unlike anything the Japanese had heard at sea. It was not the rhythmic thrum of a marine diesel, but a high-pitched mechanical fury, a sound closer to an aircraft diving at full throttle. Flames licked briefly from the exhaust, manifolds as the tachometer climbed. The dock hands stepped back instinctively. The Japanese naval report later described it with clinical precision. The enemy machine displays acceleration characteristic of aircraft. Within moments it attained operational revolutions exceeding 2,000 per minute. Such response is impossible in domestic naval engines. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. In that moment, Nishina understood the paradox at the heart of the American design. It was not a fortress. It was a bullet. The PT boat embodied a nation that could afford to treat its machines as expendable. Each boat was a weapon of velocity, not endurance. The Americans did not build to preserve. They built to overwhelm. That realization disturbed the Japanese engineers more deeply than any technological gap. for it revealed the industrial and psychological difference between two empires at war, one fighting to conserve, the other fighting to produce. What the Japanese officers could not know then was that the same philosophy extended far beyond the PT boats. It defined American logistics across the Pacific. Thousands of Liberty ships, cargo planes, and replacement engines shipped faster than Japan could destroy them. To Nishina and his colleagues, raised in a navy that revered its ships almost as living beings, this throwaway audacity was both barbaric and terrifying. Still, the engineers persisted. They measured the hull curvature, traced the torpedo tube mechanisms, even attempted to replicate the throttle controls. But what they could not replicate was the cultural confidence behind the design, the belief that speed and surprise could replace armor and discipline. In the months that followed, fragments of the captured PT boat were sent to Yokosuka for study, though by the time they arrived, the docks were already under threat from American bombers. Few of the lessons learned there would ever reach operational use. In the first week of December, 1944, the captured PT boat was officially designated Enemy Vessel No. 2971 pouces Imperial Navy records. She had been stripped, catalogued, and transported under secrecy to the Cavite Navy Yard, one of the last functioning Japanese repair bases in the Philippines. Engineers and officers arrived from Manila, Takao, and even Yokosuka to witness what was described as a specimen of foreign speed weapon. For many of them, this was their first direct contact with an intact American fast attack craft. What they found was not only a technological puzzle, but a window into the American mind. The Akashi Maru's chief engineer, Lieutenant Masaru Takashima, kept meticulous notes on the tests. His surviving diary, later recovered by American intelligence after the war, describes the first trial runs conducted in Cavite Bay before the Japanese evacuation. The entry for December 10th reads, "We launched the foreign craft at 0900, installed 2 operational engines, third under repair. Despite partial loading and damage to hull, vessel achieved 38 knots. Handling is extremely light, rudder response immediate, much unlike our torpedo boats. Fuel consumption very high, estimated 200 litres per hour per engine. No armour, yet extraordinary speed and acceleration. The Americans have built a sea dragon that cannot live long but strikes fast." That phrase, "a sea dragon that cannot live long but strikes fast," would echo in Japanese naval circles for months. It captured both admiration and fear. To the traditional Japanese officer, trained in a culture that revered endurance, such recklessness seemed alien. Yet as the Pacific tide turned inexorably against them, the irony grew unbearable. Japan, the empire of sacrifice, had been outdone in audacity by the enemy it had called decadent. At Yokosuka, naval intelligence officers compared the captured PT's specifications with their own Tokudaiyon, Special Type 4, motor torpedo boats, then under development. Those Japanese craft, often called the Karo boats, were about 75 feet long, with diesel engines producing roughly 3,000 combined horsepower, half that of the American Packards. In trials, they rarely exceeded 32 knots. Engineers noted that even if Japanese engines could match the Packard's output, their heavy steel construction would limit top speed below 40 knots. The Americans, it seemed, had sacrificed everything for agility. Even the torpedo tubes were aluminum, not steel, with quick-release triggers rather than hydraulic actuators. The Japanese were astonished that such materials could withstand the stresses of combat. But when they tested the mechanism, it worked flawlessly, simple, light, and brutally efficient. One officer remarked in his report, "Their philosophy is not to endure but to strike. They trust speed more than armour, and production more than preservation." In those words lay the psychological shock that no amount of analysis could ease. For years, Japanese naval education had preached the doctrine of Kantai-kessen, the decisive fleet engagement that would determine the fate of nations. Victory would come through superior discipline, not quantity, Every ship, every sailor, was a precious instrument of the Emperor's will, but the PT boat embodied a different truth. To the Americans, individual machines were tools, not symbols. Their power came not from spiritual purity, but from numbers, logistics, and design simplicity that allowed thousands of identical weapons to flood the seas. The engineers at Cavite ran the engines again on December 14th, this time using salvaged American aviation gasoline captured at Tacloban. The test nearly ended in disaster. As the Packard screamed toward full throttle, a backfire ignited vapors in the bilge, setting off a brief explosion that charred the inner hull. The crew doused it quickly, but the lesson was clear. This boat demanded precision and courage from its operators. There was no room for error. When Nishina submitted his final assessment to Imperial headquarters, he included a sentence that bordered on admiration. "This weapon is like a sword made of glass fragile, yet if wielded with speed, it cuts through armor." Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the very design they studied in captivity was already evolving. New American PT boats, the Higgins 78-footers, and later Elco 82, were receiving radar, heavier armament, and even rocket launchers. In the Philippines campaign alone, PT squadrons operating from Leyte and Mindoro conducted hundreds of night raids against Japanese convoys. Although most resulted in no confirmed sinkings, they forced the Japanese to alter their entire logistical system. Supply runs now had to occur at greater distances from shore, often using smaller barges under cover of darkness. The once proud destroyer squadrons of the Tokyo Express, symbols of Japan's naval mastery, had been reduced to transport duty, running supplies at half speed to avoid the wooden predators that haunted the coasts. By early 1945, the psychological impact of the PT threat far exceeded its material damage. Japanese convoy commanders routinely reported phantom encounters, torpedo wakes seen in moonlight that turned out to be flying fish, machine gun flashes that proved to be lightning. The stress of operating under constant harassment from invisible enemies wore down morale. In war diaries recovered after the conflict, Japanese officers described PT boats as ghosts of the sea, devils with wings of fire, and creatures that laugh at armor. At Yokosuka, Nishina's captured engines were dismantled for study. The Packard components were examined down to the last bolt. Japanese engineers were astonished by the machining quality, the tight tolerances, the mirror-polished valve seats, the lightweight aluminum alloy pistons. Their own industry, constrained by wartime shortages, could not replicate such precision. The Packard's supercharger design, a compact centrifugal blower that delivered instant boost, fascinated Nishina's team. They had experimented with similar forced induction systems for aircraft, but the reliability achieved here was beyond reach. One report noted ruefully, "Even if we possessed the technical drawings, we could not reproduce the materials. The Americans have industries that breathe steel like we breathe air." The more they studied, the more the Japanese engineers realized that the PT boat was not merely a craft. It was a statement of industrial philosophy. Its simplicity was deceptive. Every system, from the ignition timing to the self-lubricating rudder bearings, reflected an economy of design born from mass production. American shipyards could turn out entire squadrons in the time it took Japan to complete one destroyer. That industrial asymmetry was the true secret behind the 41 knots. And yet, the irony deepened further. When Japan attempted to adapt the lessons of the captured PT boat into its own designs, the effort faltered. The Tokudayon class received weight reductions and modified hull forms inspired by Elco geometry, but the shortage of aluminum, copper, and high-octane fuel rendered them inferior copies. Even as the engineers worked, air raids from Beiving 9 forced repeated evacuations of the facilities. By the spring of 1945, Cavite was in ruins, and the half-repaired American PT hull lay abandoned, burned out by its own fuel. Among the surviving reports, one final annotation stands out. It was written not by an officer, but by an enlisted technician who had helped with the tests at Cavite. His words, found after the war in a water-stained notebook, capture the human dimension of that discovery. I do not think the Americans are careless. They are brave in another way. They fight as if they already know they will win, and that belief is built into their machines. That line reveals the deepest irony of all the recognition that technology was only the outer expression of a nation's confidence. The PT boat's speed was measurable, its design tangible, but what truly stunned the Japanese was the idea it represented. That victory could be engineered through abundance and daring, rather than tradition and restraint. When the war ended, Nishina returned to civilian life, eventually teaching at the University of Tokyo. In lectures to his students in the early 1950s, he often referred to the captured PT boat as a lesson in humility. It was small, he would say, but it carried the weight of an empire's imagination. Those who heard him understood that he was not merely speaking of machinery. The ruins of Cavite still smouldered when the last fragments of the captured American PT boat were hauled to shore. By March of 1945, Manila had fallen, and the Japanese naval engineers who had once crowded its docks were scattered or dead. The burned hull that had promised new insight into American technology was left half-submerged in the harbour mud. Its Packard engines seized with rust, its torpedo tubes melted from the heat of incendiary raids. The sea reclaimed what it had lent to history. Yet, in reports and memories carried north to Japan, the lessons of that fragile wooden craft endured far longer than its physical remains. In Tokyo, the Navy Technical Bureau compiled its final wartime digest of foreign weapon studies. The section titled U.S. Motor Torpedo Boat Type Elco Quatrevinques Pied was barely 4 pages long, written in the terse bureaucratic style of a department already resigned to defeat. It summarized dimensions, power output, and performance, then concluded with a sentence that revealed more about psychology than mechanics. The vessel demonstrates that offensive spirit and technical boldness are achievable through quantity and simplicity rather than material superiority. To a culture that had long equated spiritual strength with ascetic endurance, this conclusion bordered on heresy. Yet it was undeniable. The Americans had treated risk as a resource. They had converted danger into a design parameter. Every Packard engine that exploded, every PT hull that burned, was simply a number in a production ledger that could be replaced within weeks. Japan, bound by scarcity and reverence for craftsmanship, could not comprehend fighting that way until it was too late. After the surrender in August 1945, Allied occupation forces discovered fragments of the Japanese research files on the captured PT boat. American intelligence officers smiled when they read the astonishment in the engineer's notes. To them, the idea that anyone would be surprised by the Packard's performance seemed almost quaint. In Detroit and New Orleans, factories had produced thousands of such engines during the war, each one tested, crated, and shipped overseas without ceremony. The Americans had never viewed their machines as marvels, only as necessities. But for post-war Japanese engineers, those same notes became seeds of transformation. The men who had studied the PT boat, Nishina, Takashima, and a handful of younger apprentices, found themselves rebuilding a nation that had lost not only its empire, but its industrial philosophy. They entered the new world of civilian engineering with an altered vision of progress. The concept of monozukuri, the art of making things, began to merge with a Western appreciation for efficiency and reproducibility. It was not that Japan abandoned craftsmanship, rather, it learned to harness it at scale. By the early 1950s, when Japan's shipyards began producing fishing trawlers and merchant vessels for export, some of the design principles quietly echoed those of the captured PT boat. Streamlined hulls, lightweight materials, modular construction ideas once dismissed as foreign recklessness became foundations of the new Japanese maritime industry. And when the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force was established in 1954, its first generation of patrol craft drew directly on studies of high-speed planing hulls derived from both British and American wartime designs. In a quiet, almost poetic way, the lessons of that burned boat had returned home. For the Americans who had once manned such craft, the story ended differently. Many of them never learned that one of their boats had been captured and studied. By the time they returned home, the PT squadrons had already become legend symbols of improvisation and courage, their exploits retold through memoirs and Hollywood films. Yet beneath the mythology, the men themselves carried the memory of fragility. They knew that speed came at a cost. Triumph and fire. In 1947, former Lieutenant Thomas G. Warfield, a veteran of the late operations, was interviewed for a naval history project. When asked about the PT boat's wooden construction, he laughed softly and said, "Wood floats, steel sinks. That's all the protection we needed." It was bravado, but also truth. The PT boat had inverted the logic of warfare. It survived not by resisting impact, but by avoiding it entirely. It was a weapon designed for motion, not endurance, and its greatest defense was its own velocity. For the Japanese officers who once examined its remains, that same principle carried a deeper symbolism. The war had shown them that endurance without motion was stagnation, and faith without adaptation was blindness. The PT boat was not invincible, it was ephemeral. But in its transience lay the secret to survival, the ability to move faster than fear, to accept impermanence as power. In 1958, long after the ashes of war had settled, a small article appeared in the Japanese journal Kaigun Gijutsu Naval Engineering. It was written anonymously, but historians believe the author was Kozo Nishina. The essay bore the simple title, Lessons from a Captured Boat. It described, without naming nations, the examination of a foreign vessel during the war, and concluded with words that transcended engineering. "We once believed that perfection was achieved when nothing more could be added. But the foreign boat taught us that perfection may also be achieved when nothing more can be removed." Those words captured the philosophical essence of what the Imperial Navy had witnessed in that wooden hull. The PT boat's power did not come from complexity, but from the deliberate stripping away of all that was unnecessary. It was the purity of function, a design that existed only to act, not to endure. By the time Nishina's students read his essay, Japan was already building the Hayanami class, destroyers, sleek and efficient vessels, powered by modern turbines, and designed with lessons drawn from both American and British influence. Few realized that, decades earlier, their intellectual ancestor had been an 80-foot wooden craft found drifting off Leyte, its engines silent but its meaning still resonant. In museums today, surviving PT boats gleam under restorers' care, their hulls varnished, their torpedo tubes empty, their Packard engines polished to mirror brightness. Visitors admire them as relics of daring, but few know that one of their sisters once lay in foreign hands, its secrets dissected by astonished engineers on the other side of the war. Fewer still grasp the quiet irony that what those engineers learned in defeat would later help shape the industrial rebirth of their nation. If one stands on the shore of Manila Bay at dusk, where the light softens and the water mirrors the sky, it is possible to imagine that old wreck still beneath the waves, a ghost of speed resting in silence. Around it drift the fragments of two empires, one that built for endurance and one that built for momentum. Both were consumed by time, yet both left traces in the world that followed. History often measures power in tonnage, armor, or firepower, but sometimes the true weight of a weapon lies in the questions it leaves behind. The captured PT boat asked a simple one: what if survival is not strength, but movement? For the men who studied it in that final winter of the war, the answer came too late. For the generations that rebuilt in peace, it became a blueprint for renewal. And so, the wooden craft that once startled its captors with engines roaring to 41 knots continued to move not through water, but through memory, a symbol of how, even in defeat, understanding can be a kind of victory. The typhoon came without warning. In the final days of 1944, as the remnants of the Japanese Navy clung to scattered outposts across the Philippines, the winds rose like the voice of the gods they had long believed protected them. Ships already battered by the American advance were driven onto reefs. Barges broke apart against the rocks, and at the Cavite Navy Yard, where a strange foreign vessel lay half dismantled, the rain fell so hard it erased the boundary between sky and sea. The vessel was the captured American PT boat. To the Imperial Navy, it had become something of an enigma, part trophy, part mystery. The officers who studied it no longer viewed it as merely an enemy craft. It was a question carved in wood and steel. How could something so fragile move with such terrifying strength? When the storm struck, the small group of engineers guarding the PT boat worked through the night to secure it. They lashed the hull with steel cables, built crude scaffolds around its flanks, and covered the exposed engines with tarps. But the rain was merciless. Salt water poured into every seam. The wooden deck swelled, the torpedo, tubes twisted from their mounts, and by dawn, the boat was half submerged in oily water. Lieutenant Masaru Takashima, soaked to the bone, watched as the storm tore away a section of the hull. One of the Packard engines broke free from its cradle and sank with a hiss into the flooded bilge. He later wrote in his journal, "It was as if the sea itself sought to reclaim what did not belong to us." The American boat resisted. Even in destruction, it would not serve another master. After the storm, only 2 of the 3 engines could be salvaged. Repairs continued, though the war situation had become hopeless. Supplies dwindled. Aviation fuel was rationed to aircraft only. Even so, the engineers persisted, not because they still believed in victory, but because curiosity was all they had left. The more they studied the PT boat, the more contradictions they found. Its hull was simple but ingenious. Mahogany planking over spruce framing, light enough to plane across the water yet strong enough to withstand the recoil of torpedo launch. The 3 Packard 42500 engines were masterpieces of industrial power, each one delivering 6 horsepower, synchronized through gearboxes that demanded precision maintenance. When running together, they could drive the boat to 41 knots faster than most destroyers. But what puzzled the Japanese most was the philosophy behind it. There was no armor, no redundancy, no reverence for preservation. Every component screamed of confidence that if it failed, another would take its place. In one internal report, the engineers noted, "This vessel is not designed to survive. It is designed to exist only in the instant of attack. Its strength lies not in endurance, but in disposability." That single line captured everything the Imperial Navy could not comprehend. For decades, Japan had worshipped the idea of perfection through permanence, the ship as a symbol of national spirit, the pilot as an extension of divine will. But here was a machine that embodied the opposite. Imperfection through abundance, built to be lost without tragedy. It was a weapon for a nation that measured value not in sacrifice, but in repetition. To the Americans, losing a PT boat meant little. There were always more. To the Japanese, losing a single vessel was the death of a work of art. By January 1945, Manila had become a battlefield. The Americans advanced from the north and south, closing the ring around the city. At Cavite, the engineers prepared to destroy their records before evacuation. Lieutenant Takashima ordered the captured boat scuttled to prevent its recapture. They poured fuel into the bilge and lit it. The flames spread quickly, feeding on the wooden deck until the craft burned like a torch against the night. As the men stood watching from the pier, one of them, an older machinist named Harada, murmured quietly, "Even in death, it runs hotter than our engines." When the fire reached the remaining Packard motors, explosions echoed across the bay. The hull collapsed inward, glowing red in the water, then vanished beneath the smoke. It was the last PT boat in Japanese hands. A few days later, the Americans arrived. Among the invasion forces landing near Cavite was Lieutenant Thomas Warfield of Motor Torpedo, Squadron 28, the same squadron that had lost P-323 6 months earlier during the Battle off Leyte. He never knew the Japanese had recovered part of it. Years later, he would remark, "We lost her to the sea. I never imagined she spent her last days in enemy hands." Warfield and his men moved on, never realizing that their enemy had studied the very soul of their weapon. After Japan's surrender, Allied investigators discovered fragments of technical notes from Cavite. They were incomplete, but detailed enough to astonish American intelligence analysts. Among them was a careful diagram of a Packard supercharger, hand-drawn in ink by Takashima himself. It was labeled Study of American Boost Apparatus for High-Speed Boat Engines. One American officer reviewing the document commented, "They understood more than we thought they could." But the war had already shifted the world beyond such studies. The age of the motor torpedo boat was ending. Jet aircraft and radar-controlled destroyer now ruled the seas. The PT boat, once the symbol of daring, became an artifact of a bygone era, a relic of close-range combat in a war that had grown too vast for wood and gasoline. Yet for Japan's engineers, the memory of that captured craft did not fade. When the nation began rebuilding its industries under Allied occupation, many of those same men trained in the Navy's technical schools found new homes in factories producing fishing boats, locomotives, and automobiles. Takashima himself joined a small-engine company that would later merge into Nissan. Nishina became a lecturer at the University of Tokyo, teaching thermodynamics, and, though none of them spoke openly of their wartime experiences, the principles they had observed in that American design efficiency, simplicity, reproducibility shaped everything they built thereafter. The PT boat, in its brief and violent existence, had passed on its philosophy. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, a group of Japanese naval veterans gathered at Yokosuka for a small reunion. Among them was Kozo Nishina, once chief engineer of the captured boat study. By then he was a professor, thin and bespectacled, his uniform replaced by a modest grey suit. When asked by a younger colleague what he remembered most vividly from the war, he did not mention battles or defeat. Instead, he spoke quietly of the night they ran the American engines for the first time. "I remember the sound," he said. "It was not like our diesels. It was alive. You could feel it through your bones. It was the sound of confidence." His words fell into silence. None of the men replied, but all understood. They had heard that sound once too, the roar of a world that believed in its machines. Nishina's later writings reflect a profound shift in thinking. In his notes from the 1950 he wrote, "Our mistake was to see technology as the servant of spirit. We should have seen it as its reflection." He meant that the strength of a nation's industry was not merely mechanical, but psychological. The PT boat had embodied America's self-image, fast, pragmatic, fearless. Japan's ships had embodied its own disciplined, ornate, sacrificial. Both philosophies carried beauty, but one had adapted faster to the modern age. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States was also moving on. By the 1962, only a handful of PT boats remained. Most had been scrapped or sold for private use. A few were preserved by veterans groups, including one restored Elco Quatrevinx footer displayed at Battleship Cove in Massachusetts. Children climbing aboard would marvel at the narrow deck, the wooden hull, the triple engines gleaming under glass. But to the men who had served on them, it was a memory that could still bring the scent of gasoline and salt to their dreams. Some remembered the thrill of speed. Others remembered the fear of facing Japanese shore batteries in the dark. All remembered the moment when the engines roared to life and the boat seemed to leap forward, not glide, but fly. Decades later, in an oral history interview, PT veteran William Coughlin described that sensation perfectly. When you hit 40 knots on an Elco, you stopped being on the water. You were in a different element entirely. You could feel the hull skimming air. It was freedom and danger at the same time. That paradox, freedom and danger, defined the entire era. It was what the Japanese engineers had seen but could never replicate. The PT boat was a weapon born from a society that trusted its people to take risks, to experiment, to fail, and rebuild. That mindset, more than horsepower or design, was what had eluded Japan's wartime system of rigid hierarchy and perfectionism. By the 1970, as Japan's economy surged, the irony deepened. The nation that had once marveled at American production now surpassed it in precision manufacturing. Japanese shipyards produced tankers and container vessels at a pace unmatched in the world. Its automakers Toyota, Nissan, Honda exported cars that embodied the very synthesis of craftsmanship and efficiency once glimpsed in that captured boat. If the PT boat had been the ghost of American confidence, Japan had learned to give that ghost new life in another form. The philosophy of motion, adaptability, and simplicity became part of Japan's post-war miracle. The empire that had fallen to speed rose again by mastering it. One might say that the spirit of the captured PT boat still lived but no longer as an enemy. It had become a teacher. In 1989, historians uncovered fragments of the old Cavite report in U.S. archives, long forgotten in a Manila warehouse. The document was brittle, typed in fading ink, but one page remained legible. It read, "Performance of enemy high-speed torpedo boat observation. When operating at full throttle, vessel exhibits agility exceeding expectations. Enemy places absolute faith in mechanical limits. No fear of failure." That final sentence, "no fear of failure," stood as a summary of an entire war's contrast. For all Japan's courage, it had feared failure too deeply to innovate recklessly. For all America's flaws, it had embraced failure as the path to progress. The PT boat was the embodiment of that difference. Today, no one knows exactly which PT boat the Japanese captured near Leyte. Some historians speculate it was PT 323, others claim it was PT 423 or PT 127, lost during the chaotic battles of 1944. The records are incomplete, but in truth, it does not matter. What matters is what it represented to those who found it a glimpse into another world's rhythm. Standing at the water's edge in Manila Bay today, one can still imagine that wooden hull beneath the waves. Time and salt have long since consumed it, but perhaps a few planks remain buried in silt, along with the melted brass of Packard pistons and the faint memory of speed. The bay itself has changed. Cargo ships now crowd the horizon. Cranes rise where the old Navy yard once stood, but the wind still carries that same mixture of salt and fuel that once filled the air during those frantic final months of war. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. 3 engines, screaming in perfect harmony, pushing a fragile craft beyond reason. That sound was the sound of a world breaking and being reborn. In the end, the story of the captured PT boat is not about machines. It is about perception, how two nations looked at the same object and saw entirely different truths. To the Americans, it was a fast boat, a product of ingenuity. To the Japanese, it was a mirror showing everything they had misunderstood about modern war. And perhaps that is why the story endures, because in that moment of realization, standing on a pier in the ruins of Cavite, watching a wooden boat burst into flames, something in the Japanese soul shifted. The worship of permanence gave way to the embrace of movement. The pursuit of purity gave way to the pursuit of possibility. That shift, though born in defeat, became the foundation of post-war Japan's strength. The very thing that once humiliated them became the spark that redefined them. In 1991, a team of divers from the Philippine Historical Commission located what they believed to be the remains of a wooden torpedo boat buried beneath layers of coral near Cavite. Among the debris were fragments of mahogany and a few rusted fittings stamped with the faint letters U.S. S.N. There was no way to confirm the boat's identity, but one of the divers, a local fisherman named Enrique Santos, later told a reporter, "When I touched the wood, it was smooth, like it was made to cut through the sea. Even after all these years, it still felt fast. Speed that endures in stillness, that is the paradox of the PT boat. And so, the story closes where it began. In the waters of the Philippines, where two worlds collided, and one small craft carried the weight of an empire's revelation. It came from across the Pacific, born of American factories, and fueled by restless imagination. It was captured, studied, and finally destroyed, but not forgotten. In its brief existence, it had shown the Japanese Navy something it had never seen before. The future. A future built not from faith alone, but from motion. Not from permanence, but from change. Not from fear, but from speed. The captured PT boat was gone, but its lesson endured. And in that endurance, the world turned a little faster. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.